It's May 2030, and David is sitting in his apartment with a calculator open on his phone. He's been doing the same math every month for a year, $1,400. That's the payment. $147,000 is what's left, and he's going to be 46 when it's done. Maybe. He made one decision 5 years ago that put him here. It wasn't a bad decision, it was more of a reasonable one, the kind that anyone in his position would have made. He got into law school, he got a partial scholarship, he called his mom, and she cried. He accepted the offer that same week. He didn't know he was supposed to negotiate. He didn't know the score that got him that offer had been devalued by forces he'd never even heard of. He didn't know that the lending system was about to change in a way that would double his cost. He just knew he got in, and he said yes. My name is Steve Schwartz. I run LSAT Unplugged. What I'm about to walk you through is a scenario. It's a stress test written from the future. Every force I describe is already in motion right now in 2026. We're going to stay in 2030 for most of this video, and I'll tell you when we come back. Let me rewind to where David's story actually started, and let me introduce Caroline because she started in the same place, 1 point apart on the same test. She owes nothing, and he owes $147,000. And the gap between them explains everything. David grew up in rural Arkansas, first-generation college student. His parents worked hard, but hadn't been to college. When he told his academic advisor he was interested in law school, the advisor said, "You should look into the LSAT." That was the entire conversation. So David took a free practice test online, sat at his kitchen table, and took it cold, got a 157. In contrast, Caroline grew up in Manhattan, went to private school. Both parents were professionals, not lawyers themselves, but close enough to the world that they understood how admissions worked. Her college counselor had guided dozens of students into law school. Caroline didn't find a diagnostic. Her counselor directly handed her one and told her when to take it. She got a 158, 1 point apart. Both of them made the same decision that they were going to do it. But what happened between that decision and their LSAT score is the entire story, because the system doesn't measure talent. It measures what talent plus money plus information can produce. And those three things were about to diverge. That fall, Caroline's counselor told her something David would never hear from anyone. Before you start studying, let's talk about accommodations. Extended time. Time and a half on every section of the LSAT. All she needed was a documented diagnosis. ADHD was the most common, from a neuropsychologist. The counselor gave her a name and said, quote, "She understands what these evaluations are for," and so Caroline's parents wrote a check for $3,500. David didn't know accommodations existed. Nobody told him, because nobody in his world had ever been told. So Caroline got the evaluation, got the diagnosis, submitted the paperwork, and got approved. Before she'd answered a single LSAT question for real, she had a structural advantage locked in. How big was it? LSAT's own published data puts it at 4 to 5 points higher on average. Their own researchers found that extended time scores overpredicted how students actually performed in law school, that the score promised more than the student delivered. And the score went on the report with no flag. A 170 with time and a half looks identical to a 170 without it, and schools couldn't tell the difference. Schools could not even ask. Now, I want to be clear. Accommodations exist for a real reason. Students with genuine disabilities deserve equal access. But by the mid-2020s, requests had exploded from about 700 per year to 15,000 per year, and LSAC was approving 98% of them. And in the pre-law circles Caroline moved in, it was an open secret. Families traded the names of evaluators the way they traded the names of tutors. A $3,500 investment for a potential return of tens of thousands of dollars in scholarship money. So here's the pattern. The advantage cost $3,500 and required knowing it existed. Caroline had both, David had neither, and the system made no distinction between them on the other end. Now, Caroline took the LSAT 4 times. Her parents covered the fees, about $1,000 in total. Between attempts, she studied full-time with a private tutor. No job, no rent to worry about. David took it twice. That's all he could afford. Between attempts, he picked up extra shifts at the restaurant where he'd worked since sophomore year, closing at midnight, studying till 2, up at 7 for class. Caroline's scores were 163, 168, 165, and 170. Highest score counts, so she's got a 170. David's scores were 160 and 164, so his highest being 164 was what counted. A 164 under standard time while working over 2 attempts. And that was genuinely impressive for what he had to work with. With 3 more attempts, a tutor, and no job, he might have hit 168 or higher. But those circumstances cost money he didn't have. And in the system's eyes, her 170 and his 164 were the same kind of number, with no context, no footnote. The application doesn't have a field for what were you up against. It just has a field for your highest score. And by the mid-2020s, more than half of all LSAT takers were retakers. Every retake reported at the peak pushed the distribution upward. School medians climbed, not because students got smarter, but because the system filtered for everybody's luckiest day. Now, I want you to notice what's happened. The same pattern from the accommodation section just repeated. An advantage that costs money, a higher score, and there's no distinction in the system. And now I want to give that pattern a name because it's going to keep turning for the rest of this story. I'm calling it the class ratchet. Every advantage costs money to access. Those advantages inflate scores. Inflated scores raise the bar for everybody. A higher bar costs more money to clear, so the ratchet turns, the gap widens, and it always hits the same people hardest. The gap after the LSAT, 6 points. On day 1, it was just 1 point. And so David applied to 4 law schools based on name recognition and what he could find on Google. Caroline applied to 12, and not for 12 options. Her pre-law advisor had mapped which schools were peer competitors, schools fighting over the same applicant pool, because those were the ones where competing offers would create leverage. She applied to 12 schools to build a negotiating position. David didn't know that every ABA-accredited law school publishes detailed data called 509 reports showing exactly what scholarships they award at every LSAT band. David didn't know you could reverse engineer the scholarship math before you applied. But Caroline's advisor had been reading those reports for a decade. David got into 2 of his 4 schools. The better one offered a partial scholarship, and he was thrilled. He called his mom. She cried. He accepted the offer that week. And he didn't negotiate, because it never occurred to him that negotiation was possible. Nobody in his life had ever negotiated a scholarship offer. It felt like a gift, and you don't bargain over a gift. Caroline got into 8 of her 12 schools. Her top choice offered a half scholarship, and her advisor told her to push, and she almost didn't. She told me later that the idea of writing that email made her feel physically uncomfortable. It felt presumptuous, like, what if they got offended? What if they pulled the offer? She sat with the draft open on her screen for 20 minutes before she could make herself hit send. She wrote, "Thank you for this generous offer. I've received a full tuition offer from peer school. I'd prefer to attend your program though, but the gap is significant. Is there any flexibility?" They came back at 75%. Her advisor told her to write back, and so she did, polite, transparent, with real numbers from real competing offers. They came back at 85%. 2 emails, 45 minutes put in, about $35,000 saved over 3 years. Now, here is something about Caroline that matters for understanding how this works. When I asked her about this later, she didn't describe it as working the system. She said, "I just followed the advice I was given." She genuinely didn't realize that the advice itself was the advantage. She thought everybody had someone who explained this. And that's the thing about structural advantage. It's hardest to see when you are inside it. Now, David had the same instinct Caroline had, that asking felt wrong. The only difference was that Caroline had an advisor who told her to push past the feeling. David had the feeling and nobody to push past it with. And so there's that ratchet again. The information was free, but having someone to deliver it was not. And then the lending system changed and the rat shit locked. For years, the bottom half of legal education ran on a quiet subsidy. Grad Plus, a federal loan program that would lend any admitted student the full cost of attendance, tuition, housing, books. No one checked whether graduates got jobs. No one asked whether the degree was worth the price. You got in, you got the money, and the system was the reason students like David could go to law school at all. But then Congress capped the lending. Graduate students could now borrow a maximum of $50,000 per year with a $200,000 lifetime limit. Caroline barely noticed. Her school fed into big law. 70% of graduates in six-figure jobs. Private lenders looked at those placement numbers and lined up. The gap between the federal cap and the cost of attendance was covered in a phone call. David's school was a solid regional institution that had served first-generation students for decades. A good school with respectable outcomes, but graduates went into mid-sized firms, government work, public interest, with starting salaries of $55,000 to $70,000. Private lenders looked at those numbers and said, it's too risky. So David needed $20,000 beyond what federal loans covered. 3 lenders rejected him. The 4th offered a variable rate loan at nearly 13%. And he took it. He'd already accepted, he'd already moved. So at this point, what was he supposed to do? Just walk away? The schools that served students like David were the ones the lending collapse hit hardest. Not because those schools were bad, because the students they served went into careers private lenders didn't want to finance, with fewer applicants, more discounting, less revenue, worse outcomes, fewer applicants. The spiral accelerated fastest at the institution serving the people with the fewest resources. And so David graduated, middle of the class, passed the bar first try, got to work at a mid-sized firm, making $78,000 a year. Caroline graduated in the top third of her class, big law pipeline, making $225,000 a year with 0 debt. They had the same diagnostic on their LSAT. They were 1 point apart on day 1. But by graduation, they were $147,000 apart, and the gap was widening. So that gap was not 6 LSAT points. It was $3,500 for an evaluation that David had never heard of. $1,000 more in LSAT retake fees he couldn't afford. 1 email to negotiate he didn't know he was supposed to send. The lending system served Caroline's school, but abandoned his. Each step in isolation was small enough to seem incidental, but altogether compounded, they produced a gap that will take David 20 years to close, if he can close it at all. Because Caroline isn't standing still. She's building equity, she's saving, she's investing. The gap that opened between them at 22 is still widening at 35. Everything David was told about this process, study hard, get a good score, go to a good school, was true, but that was incomplete. The system has rules underneath the rules. Nobody in his life had known them. Now that's not a meritocracy. That machine launders class advantage through test scores and calls it merit. Now that's 2030, but you're watching this in 2026. Every force I just described is already in motion. Accommodations at 15,000 requests a year and climbing. More than half of test takers are retakers. Lending caps are live. Medians are climbing. And the students with the least information are getting hit the hardest right now, today, by forces they don't even know exist. Now, if you already knew everything I just told you, this wasn't for you. But if you're the person studying alone, comparing yourself to scores on Reddit, wondering why everyone else seems to be pulling ahead, this is for you. You're not behind because you're less talented, you're behind because nobody handed you the manual. Now, I've just handed it to you, so let me show you what to do with it. There is a third path, and this is the part you can actually use. Maya started where David started. First generation, no money, no prelaw network, diagnostic of 157. I remember the first time I talked to her. She was sitting in her car in a parking lot between shifts. She'd been studying with a mass market prep course for 3 months, and her score hadn't moved. She was comparing herself to the numbers she saw on Reddit, people posting 170s and 172s like it was normal, and she said something I've heard 100 times. Quote, I think I'm just not smart enough for this. I asked her what she knew about how those scores were produced, who was posting them, how many times they'd taken the LSAT, whether they'd had accommodations, whether they'd studied full-time with a private tutor. She didn't know any of it. She thought she was looking at a level playing field and losing. So I told her. I showed her what was actually driving those numbers: retake reporting, accommodations, score inflation. I showed her the ABA 509 data and what it meant about the scholarship market. I told her that negotiation wasn't just possible, it was expected, and that choosing a school was a market decision, not a prestige decision. So she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Why doesn't anyone tell you this?" And then she got angry, not at me, but at the gap, and how close she'd come to walking into the system blind and making the same decisions David had made for the same reasons, because nobody had shown her the board. That was the moment the information gap closed, and it changed every decision she made. She stopped chasing a number and started building genuine reasoning ability, under timed conditions, with someone who could diagnose her specific weaknesses, not just hand her practice tests. When she finally took the LSAT, she scored a 171, but that wasn't a lucky day. Her practice tests in the month leading up to it were 169, 170, and 172. The real thing confirmed what the preparation had built. She went to the ABA's website and pulled up every school on her list. Scholarship data by LSAT band. She built her school list the way Caroline's advisor had built Caroline's for leverage. And then when the offers came in, she wrote the email. She almost didn't because she was a first-generation student on a full tuition offer, and asking for more felt like tempting fate. But she knew the money was budgeted. She knew they expected this. The only question was whether it went to her or to the next person who asks. And so she got a full scholarship, a school that would have required a 167 for the same deal 3 years earlier. Maya didn't beat the system because she had more money than David. She had the same money, which was none. She beat it because someone closed the information gap before it became a financial gap. Every turn of the ratchet that had crushed David, she saw coming, and she stepped around it. David played the game he could see, but Maya played the game that was actually being played. The only difference was that someone showed her the board. So Maya wasn't smarter than David or more accomplished, but she'd applied 3 years earlier, before the medians climbed past his number, before the lending caps hit, before the ratchet had turned those extra clicks. Same score, different year, $147,000 apart. David had the talent, he had the work ethic, he had the score. The only thing he didn't have was someone who told him how the game actually worked before he walked into it.